Cruise ship workers of Reddit. What was the biggest oh shit moment on the boat that luckily passengers didn't find out about at all? Water pipe burst in a storeroom and soaked all of the spare toilet paper. This was on day 2 of a 14-day voyage to Antarctica. The cabin stewards had to swap around rolls of paper between low-use and high-use guest cabins, and it came right down the wire. None of the guests found out or realized. Now toilet paper is hidden in every cabin instead of a centralized location. Story 2. I'm working on a cruise ship currently. One time we had to turn around to take someone to a hospital. And then there was a fire in the laundry room, and it was also pretty rocky seas. Also, people die on cruise ships, and the bodies are kept in a special freezer. I mean, you gotta do something with the body if you're at sea. Wow, this blew up. Testicles, that is all. Comment. I always wondered about the freezer thing. Spent a lot of time in the casino on my last cruise. Same few faces there each night. Day 3 or 4, one of the guys doesn't show. I comment on it to a dealer, and she says something about, yeah, my guess is he ended up in the freezer. You see a bunch of people who come here for their end. Maybe his money ran out. It seemed so heartless. Duck if I know if it was true. Story 3. I worked on a cruise ship for 3 years. I've got a lot of these kinds of stories, but here's my favorite one. Our ship officers got a call from a ship of a completely different cruise line off the coast of Cozumel, Mexico. They found one of our passengers floating in the ocean. He wasn't even near the shore at all, just floating in open water. He was alive and perfectly fine. They reviewed the security footage, and in the middle of the night, this guy was drunk on deck 5 and could be seen holding his phone, dancing to music by himself. He then climbed onto one of the lifeboats and did a running jump into the ocean. He left his phone on top of the lifeboat. His body was so fluid from being drunk that he wasn't injured when he hit the water. The cruise ship spotted him and rescued him. His family didn't know he was missing because he had booked a separate room. This guy told the news that a rogue wave pushed him off the side of the ship. He was on deck 5. So the wave would have been over 40 feet tall. Don't know what happened after that. The entire crew was talking about it for weeks before it hit the news, though. Some of you are asking if it was a sauced attempt, and I don't believe it was. He was dancing for a while by himself and seemed to be just really drunk and having a good time. He was screaming for help when he was rescued. But ultimately, he's the only one who would know. 2. I'm relaying the information I heard through the grapevine from security and other crew members. I don't know if being drunk helped him survive the fall into the water. That's just what I was told from several people on board. Comment. Alcohol might have saved his life. Too drunk to try to swim and already pissed out a lot of salt. No energy, wasted swimming, and any salt water he drank was playing catch-up with the salt pissed out. As Homer wisely put it, the cause and solution to every problem. Story 4. Since there aren't too many responses yet, here are a few good ones from similar older threads that are worth revisiting to get the conversation going. I was touring a ship for a future event. The ship was about to leave for a 100-plus day cruise. I saw a lot of old people getting on with oxygen tanks. I asked him what happens if they die on board. He said it was very common for old people blow their life savings to come spend their last days on this cruise. He also said they have a fully functional morgue. Odds are, someone died on your cruise. Think about all the old folks you see get onto the boat. For a lot of them, this is their retirement home, and cheaper than a lot of other retirement homes. They are literally taking cruises until they die, and we eventually find them in their cabins, said I am a cruise ship worker. First one is, we don't want you to know that we actually have more fun than the guests. Sure, we'll work the big white hot party that you're all going to, but once we finish our shift, all hell is breaking loose in the crew bar. And just below and to the sides of where you are sleeping, there are crew members having intimate smoking and drinking. Our beers are $1. No drugs or spirits, though. We also don't want you to know that all those funny jokes we tell you at bingo? Yeah, same ones are said every single cruise. That really funny answer you gave us about your wife during the Happy Couples game? Heard it. It was said last cruise and the one before that and the one before that. We are not allowed to duck to passengers, but we do know all the nooks and crannies the cameras don't reach. There are morgues below deck and a jail cell. We get at least 3 deaths on board a month. Some people go on a cruise to die. No, I do not know where Jack Rose is. They're not real people. Story 5. Was a passenger who found out I was on the Costa Serena in January 2012, just cruising around the Emiranian. Woke up one morning and all of the crew and waitstaff at breakfast were stone cold and depressed looking. They made us do an extra lifeboat drill that morning, to all of our confusion. Found out later that day that our sister ship, the Concordia, sank overnight but didn't have many other details. My now wife wasn't on the trip and didn't know the exact name of the ship I was on and found out before us. She was terrified till the next morning when I could get onto the ship's internet-connected computer. We also found out the crew was especially depressed because a lot of them had family on the other ship and very little information. Took a few days, but things got back to fairly normal. I just remembered doing lifeboat drills and thinking they were a waste of time, learned that lesson, reminded me about the extra lifeboat drill, added that detail. Comment. My grandmother-in-law was on the Concordia. She goes on a cruise every year still. And when asked what she does differently, she always says, well, I don't bring my expensive jewelry now. For the record, she was an art teacher on board this cruise and others as well. She had almost everything she owned aboard. I don't even think she sued or settled with any money. She's not rich, but she's very humble about the whole ordeal. Oh, it was better than that. The captain, who was probably drunk and had a civilian girlfriend in the bridge when he shouldn't, ordered the shop to steer closer to the rocks to get a better view. He ignored all alarms and navigated by eye because he claimed to know better than their navigation equipment. When they struck, he lied to the coastal authorities and said they just had a minor power outage, this heavily delayed rescue assistance. Then he tried to sneak on board a lifeboat ahead of passengers. People died as a result of all this. Story 6. Ship just arrived in Whittier, Alaska, the port for Anchorage, and an elderly passenger dropped dead while walking down the gangway. A conflict ensues between the port security and the ship's medical team. The port security didn't want the ship's medical team to get involved because it technically happened off the ship, and the local authorities had jurisdiction. There really was no saving the guy, but the ship's medical team at least wanted to try, but the local authorities wouldn't even allow the chief medical officer to start CPR. The coroner had an approximately 6-hour ETA, so the port authorities bagged up the body and stuffed it in an X-ray machine storage container in port, guarded by local police, until the coroner could arrive to take the body to Anchorage. The wife of the deceased continued on to finish the vacation for the 7-day rail trip to Denali. It was a 14-day gimmick, 7 days at sea, 7-day scenic rail trip. My understanding was the cruise line comped her entire vacation, arranged for the remains to be returned home at no cost to her, and provided a personal escort assistant for the remainder of her vacation. Comment? WTF. What sort of authorities would refuse qualified personnel the opportunity to do CPR and possibly save a human life? I find it disturbing that a port authority would rather take care of a corpse than having to ship someone to a hospital after a successful CPR. Story 7. I was playing a production show. Guitar was standing on stage with a wireless unit alone to play Purple Rain, and then all of a sudden, the house lights came on and the curtains closed. Everyone in the audience looked at me, and I ran off the stage. Turns out a sewage pipe burst backstage and there was crap everywhere. Show was canceled and the passengers didn't find out why. Story 8. Well, all the passengers found out. But on a QM2 transatlantic crossing, one of the kitchen staff got drunk one night and hurled himself overboard in the North Atlantic. The ship basically found out the next morning when the first mate kept calling on the ship-wide intercom for him to go to his post. That afternoon, the captain announced what happened and that the ship was turning around to, with the help of 3 nearby merchant ships, try to search for the him. Of course it was foggy as hell and you couldn't see 100 eyes, but just about everyone was on the railings with binoculars trying to search for the poor guy. A wedding even stopped on board. The whole party out looking once the announcement came that we were in the search area. After, shockingly, nothing was found. The concierge desk set up a multinational currency donation box to send to his family back in Chile. There were 4 days left in the trip at that point, and every day that box was stuffed to capacity. I hope it helped them. Comment! It's like that Mr. Rogers quote about looking for the helpers. Except in this instance, you had to look for people who didn't bother. It was incredible how many people wanted to help look. The ship was dead silent too, except for the foghorn. They stopped all the music so that if anything was to be heard, there'd be a chance. For as somber as the ejaculate or cum, semen stances were, it really was amazing to see so much good come from so many people. Story 9. I work on cargo ships, but I've trained with cruise ship workers, so I've heard a few stories. I read your comment below, and generally the news only picks up on accidents on ships if it's a major accident involving a lot of people. So pretty much only cruise ships, and luckily, besides the Costa Concordia, it's pretty rare these days. I do know that they have codes when speaking about incidents, though, so to not alarm passengers. For example, if someone is hurt dead, quite common if you have a heart attack at sea, then your chances suck, and they need to call for help via tannoy, they will use a code so the passengers don't know what they are talking about. Also, as someone else mentioned, certain cruise companies that attract older passengers have a separate fridge for bodies because getting through a trip without a death is not so common. Story 10. All of the computer systems run on Windows 7, including all of the automation in the machinery space, security system, fire detection system, etc. When Windows updates, it will restart the computers, as it does with a normal desktop. Unfortunately, it can also take out every computer at the same time, and we're flying blind until it finishes. People may be more worried to hear that there is a hole in the hull, yet they're actually fairly common occurrences in older ships and easily plugged. Fires happen occasionally. The most terrifying was a crankcase explosion. The fire suppression systems are good at extinguishing them quickly enough, though, so they're not even a concern to the crew, unless Windows is updating at the time. A crankcase explosion doesn't mean the engine is in pieces. Oil mist inside the crankcase explodes, and the resulting blast it pushed out through the blast doors. Also, the fire suppression system is independent. That was a joke. The monitoring system is Windows-based and just means we can't see what sensors or which sprinklers have been activated. The speed and fueling controls on an engine are mechanical and the local control is pneumatic, so keeping it running isn't a concern. All of the auxiliary systems are controlled by the computer system and are passed into local control, and controlled by the watchkeeper, if and when it occurs. Story 11. I used to be a crew member, and one time a guy working at the front desk jumped overboard after a crew party. He was found a few hours later by the Coast Guard, and everybody was asked to be discreet in order to keep the cruise running smooth, and everything was fine until the captain came on the PA and said we were delayed because a crew member jumped overboard. Then the madness begins. Rumors appear out of nowhere, and the rest of the cruise was pretty much guests asking what happened the whole time. A lot of crap happens on board. I could write a book, maybe even more than one. Another time, a guy committed SCD in his cabin, and his family was on board, including a little girl. But this time, it didn't leak to the guests. I saw the family as they were being escorted to the security office. Felt so bad for them. A friend of mine got fired for getting wasted, got pissed, and starting peeing all over his cabin while the security guys were there to take care of him. He spent the night in the little jail on board before being dumped the next day in whatever port we were also. Every time we had ice cream at the crew restaurant, people would say it was because they had to empty the freezer to put a dead body. Comment. Depends on what the person did. If they will fire the person because of job performance, they will wait until the turnaround port. Only if it's something ducked up, they will dump you wherever you are. At least that's what happened at the cruise line that I worked. Story 12. There are small fires in places like the kitchens that happen somewhat regularly. Most of the time, they're controlled quickly and no one even knows they happened. People drop dead all the time, especially on some of the nicer lines that are basically floating retirement homes. Ironically, it's when there's a survivable medical emergency that guests become aware of it, when they need to do an emergency evacuation, either by tender boat or helicopter. One of the ships I worked on, a guest jumped off an open deck while we were at sea. He survived, though. I think he was super drunk more than he was suicidal. Norovirus outbreaks happen regularly. That a literal oh crap moment for some people. Probably the worst accident that happened during my tenure was when a kid literally put his eye out on a ball valve handle on one of the open decks. Pretty sure word spread quickly on that one though. Point 2. Sorry to disappoint everyone, but I don't know U2 tsunami. I'm sure similar things have happened before. There's hundreds of thousands of people cruising at any given moment, and many of them are getting crap-faced. Comment. I can only imagine the terror of doing something drunk and having fun, and then realizing that you're feet away from a giant floating hotel that is now screaming by you at what feels like an impossibly fast speed. Then the back of the boat approaches and a football field of turbulence from those engines. Even as you got past that rocky waters, you're probably dealing with larger ocean waves that you don't realize are so big. Going underwater, treading, watching the boat get small, way faster. Thinking, holy crap, is this it? I might have minor thalassophobia, but goddamn, I cannot imagine the terror. Story 13? Probably not going to get a lot of answers. I know at least Carnival makes their employees pay for internet. I was talking with some crew, and they were asking about current events and politics because they're almost cut off because of how expensive the internet access is. Comment. I went Norwegian with a friend who is a network security administrator, and we were able to figure out a backdoor into the top-level Wi-Fi that I presume only senior crew members have access to. Made sure not to use it much, but free internet Wi-Fi calls to family every night. Thanks, NCL. Story 14. I was a cruise ship worker for a few years, and on a route between two cities, there was a really bad storm. So a few minutes after the passengers got off, the storm got so rough that the ship was ripped off the docks and drifted out to sea. Because it takes quite a while to start up the engines, it took some time until we got back to the harbor. Not really dangerous, but if it had happened while the passengers were deboarding, it could have gone badly. This happened in Sweden a few years back. Don't know enough about engines to explain why they take so long to start up, but to the people calling bullcrap, here is an article about the incident in Swedish. Story 15. Somebody shot at the navigation bridge of the ship from the shore on my last ship. The bullet bounced off and hit my colleague on the hand. No real damage, but it scares the hell out of her. Ended up going home for a few weeks. While we waited for the local police to come on and investigate and take statements, guests were told we were delaying the departure to take on fresh water. I'm still shocked that never leaked out. Oh wow, my highest rated comment ever. And I have no idea if it's because it's my cake day, an unintentional pun, or because people actually found my story interesting. Either way, thanks guys. Comment. I never had to deal with it myself, but the ship I worked on actually had protocols in place if modern-day pirates attacked. We had some kind of sonic noise weapon and could also use our fire hoses. I was told that pirates were not unheard of in the area around Shanghai. Story 16. Not a crewman, nor am I a boatswain, but I went on one of those overnight cruises to Bruges, and we caught one of the seamen with his pants literally around his ankles as he was balls deep in one of the waitresses. We skidoodled the heckaroo out of there and later found that it was actually a couple who were on the cruise as passengers and were role-playing, and that we had actually barged into their cabin by accident while drunk. Story 17. Can confirm everything here so far. Dead people, missing persons, sauced, crew and passengers busted drug milling, wild crew parties with 60-cent beers and $1 pack of smokes. So much cocaine, group intimate, etc. Breaking the crew packs, mingling rules all the time. Fires, man overboards, medical emergencies, helipad evacs. They use codes, Oscar, Oscar, equal sign man overboard, Bravo, Bravo, fire, star code, equal sign, medical emergency. Equipment fails where you drift for an extra day or two, sometimes blamed on ports or weather. Other times they are honest. Storms and rough seas, barf bags everywhere and bouncing off walls, boat drills, crew and passengers, twice per week. Hell, so many. I'll try and think of more. If you want. Source, see username. Did 5 years in shipboard casinos with Celebrity Royal Caribbean. Story 18. My dad has been working on cruise ships for 30 plus years. And on one specific cruise we were on in approximately 2008, a man who used to be a sailor all his life took his life. He wanted to die at sea, stopped taking his meds, had a small heart attack in the cafeteria, but was okay then. That night, he spent the whole night dancing with his family, who he brought on a cruise, and he died the next morning. Had to be kept in the freezers until the next stop in Greece, where his family got off and went back to Hungary. All the other passengers were informed that he went home due to his health issue, because it was a very public thing, but it was for his funeral. They still come back to the ship every year. Also, they lost the anchor once. I contacted my dad for the video and details, and we'll update soon. Update. Seems like I'm a disappointment for more than my parents. Dad can't contact me yet, but I did some digging and I believe the ship wasn't the one he was on. Let me explain. My mom showed me this that my dad sent. Due to the remarks, I believed it was Greek workers. Therefore, my dad's line and communication was weird when he was near Norway, so I believed it happened on the ship he was on. I really apologize for the misunderstanding. It was years ago, and a head injury occurred in between. In the video, by the way, the machinery snaps where the brakes are. Again, sorry. Story 19. I provide software and services for most of the major cruise lines and spend a lot of time cruising. On the new builds is when you see a lot of crazy stuff happening. When a brand new ship is built, they have to go through what's called sea trials. This is a full systems check for multiple reasons. Biggest ones being safety, emissions, and engine and navigation testing. This happens without passengers, and a lot of stuff breaks usually. They will list the ship, lean it all the way to one side, as hard as they can, and hold position while doing a circle or figure 8 pattern in the water. I had a Tild 600 LB wine cooler, fully stocked, fall face down about 12 away from me while installing a PC at a bar. It sounded like a stick or dynamite exploding from the pressure of all the bottles hitting and simultaneously breaking. I froze staring at it, and as I started to come out of the initial shock, 4 security crew members came running around the corner. No one else around except me and about $10K in broken wine, and the cooler wasn't cheap either. I just stuck my hands in the air and slowly exited the scene. I'm pretty sure if I was standing 1 foot to the right, it wouldn't have been pretty for me. Found out the yard workers forgot to bolt it down, as per protocol. Oops. One story that comes to mind with passengers, travel agents, and family was the first sailing out of the yard. The ship can hold about 4,500 passengers. She's a big girl and has 5 or 6 massive engines to power it. About 3 hours into the sail away, I heard a loud thump and massive vibrations all around. I was in an empty restaurant and saw plates and cups crashing to the ground from the vibrations. My first thought is to always see how the crew reacts. If they are calm, you can stay calm. If they freak out, you better start moving. I could see some concern, but they continued on with their business. So I followed their lead and continued doing my work too. About 4 hours after that, another loud thump and even more vibrations, then silence. After speaking with a few crew members, found out we lost 2 engines on the initial incident, and now we just lost the rest. Whatever the reason was, we lost complete propulsion, and this beast of a ship was going to go wherever the ocean wanted it to. Passengers were notified that we will be running late, but to continue having fun and drinks were on the house. No other info was given. Smart to avoid panic. About 12 hours later, a helicopter was seen, early AM hours, above us dropping down crates of engine parts. And a short time after that, we had propulsion again. And passengers had no idea why we were delayed and didn't seem to care. Story 20. One time I was on a cruise, and a few cabins down a man and woman who were cheating on their wife and husband, respectively, got super drunk and fell over the edge of their balcony from really high up. It was at night too. The whole cruise ship stopped once it was reported, and it took like an entire day to search for them. Apparently the man had his jeans or something because he had inflated them somehow, and they were floating holding them. They reported that they were stung by multiple jellyfish and were super cold the whole time. That must have been the scariest, most terrible 18 hours of their lives. Story 21. A new guy miscalculated the pool treatment, and one of the jacuzzis ended up with a pH less than 2. It was discovered before the area opened, and that one remained netted for the rest of the day while it was balanced. A wiper painter stood on a small cupronickel black water pipe, to reach higher on the bulkhead. Literal oh crap moment, from the floor to his knees. If you're pushing 140 revs on the shaft and the ship still won't break 15 knots, check the bulbous bow for whales. Story 22. No, the house band doesn't care if you are the second coming of Eric Clapton. We aren't going to invite you on stage to hear your version of cocaine. Just relax and enjoy yourself. Yes, we sometimes have bad nights. Playing 3 4-hour sets, 5 nights a week for months on end, does leave some room for us to not be on our A game sometimes. Just relax and enjoy the show. Well, looks like we need to cut the set short tonight, kids. The drummer just had a heart attack. Be sure to tip the waitress. The DJ will be right up to keep the music going. Story 23. My buddy worked in the theater on a cruise ship and always had fun stories from traveling around. Cool thing. Beers are less than $1 in the crew bar. Bad thing, you always have to be sober enough to operate a lifeboat and man your station during an emergency. Crew members getting left in countries because they were off getting drunk and chasing cute locals. Old people dying and being put in a freezer on a low deck near one of their storage areas. Good times. Story 24. A passenger went missing and nobody could find him for a couple days. It turns out he committed sauced in the fan room, so everyone had been sucking dead guy air for a while. We definitely kept that one under wraps. That's the only one that the crew kept secret, but I have some crazy funny stories about working on ships. I was a musician and one time a guest and a fly on act who joins the ship for a cruise to perform one show. Thought he was ducking Freddie Mercury and threw out his Digipack CDS like ninja stars into a completely dark house. It ended up clocking some old woman a half an inch below the eye, and she had to go to medical. The husband wrote the cruise director a very threatening letter, basically saying, "My wife almost went blind, so I strongly suggest you give us a free steak dinner." I would usually be hungover, so I'd drink during the day to get over it. I'd go out in port and get smashed and come back. On turnaround days where a new group of passengers arrive, we have to take attendance and do a life jacket demonstration. I was so drunk one time, I threw up in the stairwell as passengers were coming in. I somehow didn't get fired or even reprimanded, even though everything I puked up was straight liquid and smelled caustically like booze. We all have small cabins in close proximity to each other. We usually keep a spare key under our nameplates in case we lock ourselves out by accident. One night I woke up to a fellow musician who didn't have a shirt on pissing into my wastebasket in the corner. He was so drunk, he thought my cabin was his, and he got the key from behind the nameplate and just decided to piss into the closest hole. Story 25. I currently work for a cruise line on shore. I have assisted people who want to bury their loved ones at sea. Obviously, the bodies have to have been cremated and the ashes have to be in a biodegradable container. Story 26. My buddy is right next to me. We work on boats together, but he used to work on a cruise ship. This is what he says. I have plenty of oh crap moments, but I'll give you my biggest oh crap moment. So we were stuck in the locks of Amsterdam for over 4 HRS and no indication of what's going on. After a few HRS had passed, the captain came on the PA system. And the reason we didn't leave was because there was a live mine from WW to 1 kilometer from the front of the ship. Sorry, I'm on mobile and had to condense the dialogue. Story 27. My sister worked on one for a few years. People did eventually find out. But they use code words over the PA system for various events that can happen. A guy got into a fight with his family and jumped. The ship circled back and used spotlights from their stage shows to look in the water. They could hear screaming briefly, but the guy was never spotted. These were shark waters as well, so he either drowned or was eaten, or a bit of both. Story 28. I haven't worked on a cruise, but I did go on a Disney cruise in February. Obviously, we knew this happened, since I can tell the story. As an aside, the cruise was amazing. And even though Disney cruises cost more, ours was entirely done with rewards points. The ship never had lines for anything, and the staff was beyond incredible. Anyway, a small electrical fire broke out in a cabin down the hall from us. It's jolting being woken up on a cruise by a general alarm and opening the cabin door to see a crewman sprinting down the hall with a fire extinguisher. The ship's captain quickly walked past as well, with a couple officers flanking him. A few minutes later, they had crews stationed throughout the ship's halls, explaining to everyone what had happened and that everything was fine. The family that had been in the cabin got moved elsewhere, and at the next port, it seemed like they brought in extra people to clean the floor to remove the smell. It was mild anyway. Fires on ships are scary, and the response is always immediate and probably proportionally larger than it needs to be. My father was a firefighter on his cruiser when he was in the Navy, and he had similar stories. Ships don't duck around when it comes to fire. Story 29. Finally, something I can comment on. I work as a contractor on cruise ships and jump between ships all throughout the year. I've done 18 cruises in the last year. And being a contractor, I get a lot of interaction with guests and crew. The crew is trained in virtually every possible situation you can imagine and have required drills every week. There is quite a bit of death on board, and there is a morgue on most ships I work on. A lot of sauce that nobody catches until someone reports them missing, and you hear they jumped in the middle of the night. In fact, I've been on board when they had more deaths than they had room for, so they threw a surprise ice cream party for the crew so they could make room in a separate freezer. But what actually was the craziest experience for me on board was when we lost satellite the night of the last election, and when everyone woke up, we got it back, and the results were just in. I've never seen a more divided ship amongst guests. Arguments, parties, fistfights. It was 8 a.m. where we were at the time, and it's definitely a weird way to start a day at sea. We also had a guest get stuck on a mountain in Alaska, and we had to call in air support before we could leave to get them back. And my favorite story to tell is when I was saying the Red Sea, we had armed security on board, and they just stood and watched the water in case of pirates. We had required lights out and curtains closed after 6 p.m. for our own protection, and it was always fun to see a tiny army ready to fight pirates at any given moment. Those dudes could drink. Story 30. Worked on a ship where the center azipod up and died due to contaminated lubricating oil. A friend on the engineering staff said that from the time they noticed the temperature change to complete FUBAR was less than 10 seconds. Did the company replace it? No. Divers stripped the blades off the prop next turnaround day, and they left it that way for the next 6 months. Dry dock is expensive, y'all. Ran the other 2 props at 110% and shortened our port stays to compensate for the reduced speed. Never mind what would have happened if we'd lost another one in the middle of a storm brand new ship too. Used to leak through the front shell gates when we crossed the Bay of Biscay. I'm sure the guests wouldn't have been happy to see 3 inches of water sloshing back and forth on the luggage deck every cruise. Story 31. Let's see. Leaving Southampton to New York, we took the exact path the Titanic did during winter. Sailed through a hurricane north of Germany. We were surprisingly close to tipping over. In a few places, machinery weighing thousands of pounds came off their moorings and slid around. The shortest time it took for someone to die on board? 45 minutes. I'm not kidding. We were still in sight of Miami and turned around to drop off the stiff. Fire. Often in a laundry room because dumbass crew like to put things like shoes or overload the dryers. Also, ironically, a lot of uncontrolled fires inside the incinerator. Don't smoke in your rooms. Especially if you've gone to a place like Mexico where certain things are legal. Bringing something with you can have you prosecuted as an international drug smuggler. Speaking off, on my first tour on a cruise ship, a fellow crewman was found with a 5-pound brick of pot. He was fired. The pot incinerated. Nothing else. Guy was not reported to any police agency because of the potential bad press. Others may make it sound like a nonstop party for crew, but by law, we aren't allowed to ever go above 0.08 back while on board. Not while working, while living there. Is security rather lax about this? Yeah, but not everyone wants to risk being fired and kicked off the ship in a strange country, which is what happens with crewmen Dewey. Zero tolerance. Oh yes, I almost forgot this story. I was friends with the youth staff on board. Early in one week, they had this 12-year-old kid come to them. Problem is 12 is not 13 and absolutely cannot join the teens group. Insurance thing. He's 12 but 6'1". Parents get mad, leave their younger daughter, but the 12-year-old declines playing in the kids group. During that vacation, that 12-year-old was arrested for attempted kidnapping a 30-year-old woman, intimatal assault, and attempted rare. The youth staff I worked with were both relieved and freaking out. What if we did let him in the teen group? An uncle stayed with the younger sister on board while the parents stayed behind to deal with their son. Story 32. Bear with me, as the details of this are pretty fuzzy. I played in the show band for a ship once. We were in Belize and supposed to be back on the boat by 6 p.m. sharp, as we were leaving port at 6:30. Most of the band is stumbling drunk back to the dock at about 5:30 when music director gets a call. MD, hello? As he's listening, his face drops, turns white, and then begins to boil red. MD, what the ever-loving duck? Don't say a goddamn word. I'm on my way. Before any of us can ask what happened, MD takes off in a full sprint out of the docking area. The band mostly tended to hang out together, but on this particular day, keyboard player wasn't with us. KP was a notorious partier, and often a pretty sloppy drunk and reckless. Not knowing how else to help, the rest of us boarded, went through security, and informed the security guys that MD just took off, and neither he nor KP had made it back yet. We headed down to the crew bar for more drinks and to wait out MD and KP. 6 o'clock came, then 6:30, then 6:40, and the ship hadn't moved yet. This was pretty strange, seeing as the crew waits for no one. If you're not boarded by 6, you're staying on your own. Finally, the ship starts to depart at 6:45, and we catch MD rolling into the crew bar. It turns out KP tried to buy cocaine from an undercover cop in Belize. Yeah, so MD went to the station, bailed his ass out, and they just walked. Again, I'm completely fuzzy on the details. But I do know that security, hotel operations, and the passengers never found out exactly why they were late, and Cape stayed on ship every time we made port in Belize from then on. Oh, and he also paid for all of our drinks for a month. The band operated on a beer fine system after all. Told her, keyboard player got busted in a foreign country trying to buy cocaine, and held up the ship departure time by 10 minutes getting bailed out. Story 33. A pipe burst and flooded the kitchens. It was a waste pipe, so we had to throw everything out and get a sanitation company to meet us at our next port and go out and buy all new inventory. We gave out vouchers for food, but if we had been further from port, that would have been awful. Story 34. We were on a family cruise, and after a wonderful dinner, we were trying to get back to our room. As we got to our floor and headed down the hallway, there was a new dead end. A wall had appeared that separated us from our room. We were told we had to go the opposite way and go around another hall on the other side of the boat. As we walked, we noticed many new walls. Once we got to the other side, the floor was wet and one of the new walls was leaking water from behind it. It took us 20 minutes to navigate the newly built-out labyrinth. We were so worried we were taking on water we could barely sleep that night. Story 35. I was on a Disney cruise last year, transatlantic, and one night there was a special code that came blaring into our room, whatever Disney's secret fire code is. Too lazy to look it up. They never came back on to tell guests what it was about. People above me thought the ship was sinking. I heard them run for their life vests, closet doors slamming. I peek out into the hallway, dazed and confused passengers. I got online to look up the code and learned it was a fire code. To make a long story short, there was a fire in one of the restaurants. I'm going to assume that they had to call the code into the staterooms because, there was a ducking fire on the ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. If they come on and say fire, people will panic and there would be mass chaos. But the fact that they never bothered to follow up on the code tells me in the case of a real emergency, we dead. I still love to cruise. 1010 will do it again. Story 36. It was actual crap. Stranded on the ocean with our sewage system backed up. Never go on a cruise. Oh yeah, the passengers did find out about that one. Story 37. Fires. I worked on a cruise ship for 2.5 years and we had 3 major fires. They were all in crew areas and were controlled and extinguished by our awesome fire team. The passengers never knew what happened, only that their waiter had to leave in the middle of dinner service. People don't realize how much training the crew members go through to handle these situations, and they will never know that their waiter just helped save the whole goddamn ship. Story 38. My oh crap moment was when I was hired for a ship on 2-day notice. Trombone player. When I got on the ship, I found out that I was replacing a guy who had just died in a jet skiing accident in Nicaragua. Everyone in the crew knew it, and the last cruise's passenger knew it, and the entire band that I was joining was obviously traumatized. In the end, it ended up being my favorite contract. But the first few weeks were difficult for everyone. Rip Bone Guy, I never knew you, but I know they all loved you. Story 39. I worked on a ship almost 15 years ago. Many stories. This happened to a friend of mine. A family came on. They had a teenage son who was not interested in the cruise. As soon as the family got to their room, he jumped off his balcony, which is insanely dangerous. They fished him out, and the family got kicked off the ship. Another fact, there is a small jail-like area called a brig. On my ship, it was on the crew floor, and it had a one-way mirror. Usually it was used for drunk or disruptive passengers. We once had an entertainer find out his ex was coming on the ship. That made him a little stabby, so they put him in the brig until the next port. Story 40. I've worked on cruise ships, English and American, for 13 years, and I have some great stories and some pretty sad stories. The one I'm about to tell didn't happen to me, though. It happened to a friend who is still a cruise director to this day. I'll call him CD. CD was strolling along a guest corridor when he came across an old man sitting outside his cabin on the floor. When he asked the gentleman if everything was okay, the man just looked up and shook his head. CD asks what the problem was, and the old gentleman said, "My wife's in bed. I think she's passed away." CD calls security, and they enter the room to find his elderly wife had in fact passed and couldn't be resuscitated. She was pronounced, and all the wheels are put into motion to take the body off the following day, and he would be helped with all the arrangements to help get him and his wife's body back home. The following, the man told staff that he would like to stay for the rest of the cruise, and it's what his wife would have wanted. The company allowed for the body to remain in the onboard morgue until they arrived back at the home port a few days later. Apparently, the guy won bingo, attended the Captain's Dale in formal dress, and was seen to be really enjoying the remainder on the cruise. Story 41. My dad worked on a cruise liner in the 80s. When it was in the Falklands as a troop carrier, it was nearly sunk by a French Exocet missile fired by the Argentinians. I believe it was closer than 100 m before it was destroyed. Another time, one of the engineers discovered a fire in the engine room, and so as not to cause too much of a panic by sounding the alarm, he ran around the middeck, shouting "Fee!" in the main engine room, and then ran back downstairs. Finally, another fire was once discovered by a boiler technician who, whilst not on duty and drunk, put it out with his makeshift male firefighting equipment. Story 42. Story 1. I worked on a cruise ship at the front desk. One afternoon, the desk received dozens of reports of a man overboard. As we were passing by an especially scenic area, there were a lot of people out on the decks and balconies to see this person in the water. Of course, the ship did a 180 and sent boats out to find the person. The person they find was the ship's safety officer who while exhausted, was okay. Everyone assumed that the ship's safety officer jumped in after the person, so other boats kept looking. Though, as it turned out, the officer was having an especially rough day and thought that would solve his problems. Guests assumed it was a passenger in a bathrobe, seeing his white uniform, and we let them think that. Story 2. I was working the overnight shift at the front desk, and the ship's emergency alarm goes off at midnight while we are at sea. This is the one that means passengers must go to their emergency muster stations and only used in extreme emergencies. From what I heard, the crew decks were absolute mayhem, including crew members seen running down the crew halls in their underwear, trying to get back to their cabins to get in their emergency gear. Crew members were literally preparing lifeboats in case the captain ordered an abandoned ship. In the end, it was realized that the alarm only sounded in crew areas while passengers slept soundly in their cabins, completely oblivious. As it turns out, someone on the bridge forgot to silence a silly alarm, which resulted in the alarm going off by accident. Why it is designed that way, who knows? Story 43. The ship always needs a certain number of crew members on board. So when it's your week cruise to be a designated crew member, your passport and ID are confiscated, so you literally cannot leave the ship. This was from a crew member I connected with on Grindr and had a drink with on his night off. I didn't see it posted in the thread, so I decided to share. I can't follow up or relate to anyone, unfortunately. Story 44. Not sure if your post has actually been removed or if this will ever be seen, but I'll try to answer. I cruise quite a lot and have seen quite a few things so far, including bad storms, which are always fun. I only cruise on small vessels, usually. The crew aren't as happy as you think they are. Last month, I was out on deck and heard someone talking. It was the ship's cruise director, and he was Skyping his family, wife and 2 young daughters. It was his birthday, and he said he wouldn't celebrate until he got back home to England. Just remember, he had to be on the ship another 6 months before seeing his family. Just imagine arriving back at port, knowing you're about 100 miles from your family, but not being able to see them for ages. His daughters didn't want him to leave, but he had to go. He was even getting tearful. He hung up, then had to go back inside to put on the same happy, enthusiastic show as he does every night of his life. Story 45. Heard this one from a friend who worked the cruise ships in the ADS. So it was one of those mainly senior citizen cruises. An older gentleman passed away while lying on one of the outside sunbeds. Luckily, one of the officers was first to notice and quickly called over 2 South American staff members, whose English was less than perfect. And he tells them, "Get rid of that quick before anybody sees it." The officer, meanwhile, tracks down the gentleman's partner, and after consoling her through her grief, she asks to see the body. He takes her to the refrigerator where they keep people who pass away, and it's empty. He calls the ship's doctor, who knows nothing about any body. Now furious, the officer hunts down the 2 staff members who moved the body. He finally finds them and goes ballistic. "Where the hell is that body?" They look at each other, and one of says, "You say get rid, we get rid." The officer is now confused. "What are you talking about?" In answer, the man makes a throwing over the railing motion. In hindsight, I wish I'd asked my friend what they told his wife. Story 46. Currently working on a ship sailing out of NYC. Just a few months ago, we had a passenger go through a breakup with his girlfriend over the phone while on board. He went to his mother's cabin, told her goodbye, and before anyone could do anything about it, he ran up to deck 15 and jumped about 150 feet into the water. The rescue boats searched for hours and never recovered the body. Everyone assumed he got sucked under the ship and into the propulsion system. Protocol is not to tell other passengers more than they need to know in the event of an emergency, so we all had to keep quiet. Also, on decks TT, -1 through 2, there are a bunch of watertight doors that divide up the different compartments that have several tons of force behind them when closing. They will stop at pretty much nothing when set to close. We once had a contracted mechanic on board doing some temporary work, and he dropped a tool on the wrong side of a closing watertight door. He reached back to grab it, and his arm proceeded to get stuck, and the door closed on his shoulder, totally sliced off his arm, and he bled out and died before someone found him. Story 47. Sorry, I am a couple hours late to the party, but I worked on ships for about 4 years and witnessed a lot of what was already said. The one that stuck out to me was an embarkation day in Miami. On embarkation day, all the public areas of the ship are open, like the theater, spa, gym, etc., so new passengers can see them and get settled in, but mostly so we could sell them packages. An older man was checking out the gym in regular clothes, jeans, Hawaiian shirt, flip-flops probably, and decided to go for a run on the treadmill. He had a heart attack and died right there in the gym before the cruise even started. Because we were still in port, Miami PD and the coroner had to come on and investigate, etc. The problem was the gym and treadmills on this ship had a huge glass wall to the pool deck. Who knows how many people witnessed him die before the crew had a chance to close down the space. The crew simply closed the pool area and gym. The coroner took the body, and the crew set sail a few hours late. No announcement was ever made. Story 48. I want to preface this by saying I never confirmed this myself, but was general consensus by most of the crew. Used to work on cruise ships. Generally, we leave ports of call around 4 or 5, never really staying later than that due to port regulations. One night, we had a surprise late night at a port. All the passengers and most of the crew had a wonderful time. It was a port of call with a very active nightlife. I was part of the last groups coming back to the ship and noticed a few men in scuba suits entering and leaving the water. Large machinery and the water off the stern of the ship sporadically lighting up, almost like someone was welding underwater. A few days later, I was in the mess hall and heard that the ship underwent heavy maintenance to repair an area taking on water. Story 49. Hubs and I went on the Oriana to the top of Norway for our honeymoon this February-March. Thoroughly recommended. But when we were in Alta, some 70 degrees north, it was -15 during the day and got down to -27 both nights we were there. Pretty cold. In fact, so cold that the poor old girl had her pipes freeze, the electrics go out. They were cooking lunch in the dark using guys with torches. Captain Gray even said later that he'd checked Oriana's logs and she'd never endured colder than -10 in Alta before then. Then worse, as we were heading back south and hit the North Atlantic Current, which was -6, and so melted all those frozen pipes. Some flights of stairs and a little mini buffet were closed because of water damage, and they did say on disembarkation, "If you're a plumber, please stay." My housemate's sister works for Carnival and mentioned to me they'd had an emergency meeting about Oriana's predicament. Story 50. I was one of those events no one found out about. I went on a cruise when I was really sick BC. I thought I was dying and wanted one last hurrah with my husband. I ended up becoming paralyzed during a meal on the ship. The waiter was so discreet and they had a whole protocol to deal with it. I don't think any diners around even caught on. Everyone I interacted with remained calm and very polite. The shipboard doctor was surprisingly good. Made me realize with how many old and sick people that cruise. There are lots of medical emergencies of all types probably on many cruises, and they are completely equipped and prepared to deal with a lot of them efficiently and discreetly. On another cruise, one of the excursions was a private plane scenic tour. It was popular. One of the planes crashed, and it took a while to learn that it was carrying passengers from another ship that was in port. Really put a damper on the rest of the cruise for everyone, though. That one wasn't kept a secret. Story 51. I worked as an ordinary seaman with NCL in Hawaii for 5 months. I had all kinds of responsibilities that changed all the time depending on which officer felt like a big boy that day. Working with the night washdown crew, we would see people having intimate in the hot tubs almost every night, and they didn't know that everyone on the bridge, engine room, and security room watching them too, using the cameras. When I was maintaining the chemical levels in the pools and hot tubs, I noticed how often kids and adults would crap in them. They would immediately have to be cleaned, but it took time to get the pH levels correct for each pool. And a few times, people had their hair discolored by the chemicals when they tried to just lift the rope setup to keep them out, just because they wanted in the hot tub right that instant. Then there was the crafty chief mate that took my pH level logs and doctored them right before a big audit. Then there were all the STDs passing around the 1,000 crew members. Those are just a few of the stories. Story 52. I was a passenger and was shooting the crap with one of the crew members late at night. He told me that on an earlier cruise, someone had died in a hot tub the first night out of port, and people didn't know for hours. He managed to stay propped up, and his sunglasses helped hide it. Several passengers entered the hot tub during the time and assumed he was antisocial for whatever reason. The crew discovered him when they were closing the pool area for the night. They moved the body downstairs to the morgue. None of the passengers except the guy's family found out about it. Story 53. I worked on a cruise ship in guest services, and we would deal with a lot of crazy people. One of the craziest things to happen was when we found immigrants from Cuba floating on a life raft in the middle of the ocean. We had to bring them all on board and keep them in crew area until the Coast Guard came to get them. We basically told guests they would be off the ship by morning, but people were freaking out. The Coast Guard came in the middle of the night and then they were gone. Also, guy breakouts are really bad on ships. Wash your hands, people. Story 54. Didn't actually work on the cruise ship, but went on a cruise when I was in college for a class trip. We could only afford cabins way down in the bowels of the ship next to the crew quarters. A lot of them were college-age kids too, so we got along well. Was up on the top deck one day catching some sun, and over the speakers we calmly hear Code 10, top deck, Code 10. We looked around and didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Went back to relaxing. That night we were talking to some of the college crew and they said that some older lady and slipped getting out of a hot tub, tumbled over the side of it and smacked her head, killing her. The crew was on it super quick, and basically none of the passengers knew about it beside their immediate family. They really keep things hush-hush on those things. Story 55. Only one I have witnessed were 2 fires in the engine rooms. Scary thought. Because of the nature of the ships, normal workers are picked to be firefighter trained. So your onboard firefighters will be engineers or waitstaff or galley men? They chose the big bulky ones who won't be blown over when the water comes out the hose. Story 56. Former cruise ship employee. I was 19 and put in charge of a section in case of emergency evacuations. It was supposed to be my job to direct people to lifeboats. Yeah, I never went to my post. I was an AV guy. I had no training for emergency situations at the time. I wandered around an empty ship during drills before departure. Yeah, so if there was an emergency, better hope you weren't in my lazy-ass 19-year-old section or you were ducked. This was 10 years ago. I've since developed a more professional work ethic. Story 57. Don't want to say the name of the ship, but it rhymes with cervical ablation. This was 15 years ago. About 2 days in there was a pretty consistent noise and vibration that made it difficult to sleep. I had been on the ship before, so I chalked it up to just being in a different location and decided to just deal. There was an announcement that we would be making an extra stop for some type of mechanical repair. By about day 5, I noticed there was a slight list in the ship, but there were no addition stops or announcements. I asked one of the crew who I had talked to before, and he said there was nothing to inform us about. On the last day when we were departing, I asked him again what had happened. He just smiled and said, "You don't want to know. Be happy we're back in port." To this day, I know that damn ship was listing, and I'll never know why. Story 58. I don't work on a cruise ship, but on a ro-ro ship that can take a few passengers. We got complaints one day of the toilets in one of the passenger cabins not flushing. After the engineers spent hours flushing out the sewage system to get into the right pipes, turned out the only couple on board had been dumping all their condoms down the toilet, which had clogged our whole system. Story 59. I know I'm a little late, but I have such a good one for this. One of our spa attendants lost it. I mean, seriously lost it. He had worked for the ship for years and was slowly building a kill list of employees that he was planning to kill. He was slowly sending himself a gun in pieces so that it wasn't caught by ship security and incoming packages, and was nearly done when his roommate found the list. Story 60. On a cruise ship I worked on, a crew member murdered another crew member in the crew mess. He walked up and bludgeoned him with a hammer in front of all the other crew. The passengers had no idea. On the same ship, when we were in dry dock in Germany, a crew member accused his girlfriend of cheating and strangled her in his cabin. Also, passengers and crew had no idea for a few days. The same ship, Ship of Death, also had several family members of officers die when leaving the ship during dry dock. They had invited family on board for a party and dinner to celebrate the end of the ship build. When they all left the ship, it was raining, and they all rushed to leave the ship. As they ran across the gangway, it collapsed and several members died. This was the reason that regulations came about to have only 15 people on the gangway at one time. Story 61. I worked on ships for 3 years, and boy, the stories you hear about or live through. This one takes the cake, though. My colleague in the kids center, who we all found creepy AF, is now a convicted intimate predator serving 14 years. Story 62. I worked on one for a year. During a rehearsal in the main auditorium, one of the dancers got his foot caught in the crack of the hydraulic platform that raises up and down. Because some of the safety sensors were broken, the lift completely shut and sucked his foot into the space between the platform and the stage, which was about a centimeter. I was friends with a lot of the dancers who witnessed it, and they were pretty shook up from the screams. After they got him stabilized, the captain came on and told us we were making a stop in Cabo so he could be flown back to the States for emergency surgery. I felt so bad for him. It was his first contract, and he was so excited to be there. Story 63. One of the waiters had to go to the back room really bad, but it was during the dinner rush, so the supervisor told him to wait. He ended up running out of the restaurant and crapping his pants on the way out and left a trail behind him. Also, not really an oh crap moment, but the amount of workers who get pregnant is pretty crazy. So much ducking goes on between the crew, it's crazy. Story 64. A cruise ship I worked on had just had a refit in dry dock with brand new furnishings. They had hung a giant chandelier over the main lobby atrium, which was actually installed by a company who doesn't do work for cruise ships. The result? They used the wrong size fixing bolts that were unable to take the force of the ship's movement, in a swaying 2-ton chandelier, and these bolts sheared and the chandelier fell down onto the atrium deck at approx 2 a.m. in the morning. Luckily, it happened at the time that it did, as they hold all the events there during the day, such as dial parties, fashion shows, art auctions, etc. This would have caused fatalities if the timing were different. Story 65. My first week on the ship, a crew member committed SOST. The captain announced over the ship PA that there was an unexpected death of a crew member, but didn't mention the ejaculate or cum, semen stances. The guests knew someone had died and that the crew was taking over the theater for a memorial, but not how he died. The guests were more upset that it disrupted their vacation. Story 66. A teenage girl and her 10-ish-year-old brother had a serious argument on an open deck at night. She was much bigger than him. She picked him up by his throat and held him over the side of the ship. We were doing a Baltic run, and between some ports with serious distance between them, so the ship was sailing around 26 Ks, and it was pitch black. Security happened upon them while this was happening, and thank God prevented an either intentional or accidental Oscar. Man overboard. The girl was kept in the brig until morning, and the family was disembarked and repatriated immediately. Story 67. My in-laws went on a cruise and someone killed themselves by jumping off the damn ship in an empty area. They found out like hours later and had to go back looking for him. Never found the body. Everyone knew though. Story 68. My 6-month contract went uneventful for the most part. While we were crossing the Atlantic, leaving the Mediterranean and heading for the Caribbean, an older passenger got deathly ill, so much so that we had to detour and hand him off near Bermudas. Obviously, his family and friends knew, but the detour went unnoticed by the rest of the passengers. Also, the casino manager got crap-faced in Venice, missed the ship, and caught up in Santorini. He somehow managed to board before the ship set sail. Story 69. I was on cruise about 12 years ago as a passenger, and we were off the coast of Mexico leaving a port. I do not remember which one. All of a sudden, the ship started shaking. Really bad. Things started falling of shelves, and it was really scary. We thought we hit a reef or something. The next day, the captain announced over the PA that we had gone over the epicenter of a 8-magnitude earthquake. The port, we found out later, had been basically destroyed. Story 70. Red parties is not a party you weren't invited to. It means fire. Blue parties is still not a party. It's a flood. And the call for Mr. Mob? They're not calling for a man whose surname is Mob. They're calling out that there has been a man overboard. Mob. Enjoy your cruise with your newfound knowledge. Story 71. I worked for Carnival in the late 90s. We had a rash of people die on a cruise. Nothing sinister, but 7 elderly people died in a 3-day period. We ran out of room in the freezers to store them. The captain offered time and a half pay if we'd board the extra dead bodies in our crew cabin. I took on 2 and was paid double the entire 2-week cruise. They both fit in one bed and kept quiet the entire time. Story 72. No big oh crap moment during my time working aboard, but I do recall them having a dive team periodically go down under the ship to check for explosive devices and guests. Just thought, oh look dear, they have divers. Story 73. I once was working loading a cruise ship and a man with a warrant once jumped off the side of the ship into the Hudson River, swam to the West Side Highway and hailed a cab just to avoid getting arrested. Police were waiting for him to come through customs. Story 74. Getting the call at 2 a.m. to prepare the lifeboats because there was a fire in the engine room. From what I could find out, the ship was 7 minutes from calling an evacuation because of this situation. Much beer was had the next day. Story 75. I worked on a cruise ship in Hawaii. One time we ran out of rice and the Filipino employees refused to work until we got more. We made an emergency port on Oahu and got more. I don't think anyone noticed except for the kitchen crew. Story 76. I work on a passenger ferry. We found some guns being smuggled into the country. Had to keep that quiet. Kind of hard to do with police dogs on board. Story 77. Had a crew member jump overboard. January 2012. Monarch of the Seas. Not sure how much the guests knew, but we all heard Oscar, Oscar, Oscar starboard side and knew it wasn't a drill. Poor bloke.